So it's absolutely great to invite Ian to come and speak to us today. Procurement is where companies can really put their money where their mouth is in terms of their sustainability aims, and but navigating how to do it, how to do that, and how to do that well, and put responsible procurement into place is difficult. So I'm absolutely delighted that Ian will be taking us through that. And for now, I will hand over to Ian, and we'll hope that the magic of Teams works.
Hello everyone, Ian Scholar. With a name like Scholar, I had to get into teaching at some point in my career, but I've been involved in procurement and supply chain for just coming up to 40 years now, which is crazy. And 20 of those years was actually in procurement supply chain roles, and the rest of it was talking about procurement and supply chain. So, which is the project, or one of the projects I was working on that Camilla's talked about there. And in fact, quite a lot of the work that Camilla did on that project fed into the thinking that we have at the Chartered Institute of Procurement and Supply, because that was one of our earlier projects that we worked on. I've been here for a while now, and sustainability is one of my key topic areas for talking to procurement professionals about. And one of the big questions I often ask them is, what's going on in your supply chain beyond your tier 1 suppliers? So the suppliers that you're actually directly contracting with, what's happening in their supply chains? And predominantly people haven't got a clue. They don't know. I was at an event recently with quite a lot of different procurement professionals, and I asked them, and one person in the audience put up their hand knowing what was happening beyond their tier 1 supplier, which is not unusual, unfortunately. So, and we need to do something about that. That needs to change. So often when I'm talking to procurement professionals, I talk about these things. I talk about, oh, hold on, let me just go back. I talk about donuts. Now, some of you sweet treats, some of you, hopefully most of you will know what a donut is, but if you don't, they're sweet treats. And I use donuts as an example because it's close to my heart, probably a bit closer to my stomach. But I use donuts because of the major commodity that's used within a donut, which is sugar. And the reason I use this is I'm trying to get procurement and supply chain professionals to become much more aware of what's going on in their supply chains and be more curious. Curiosity is probably the #1 key skill we need these days as a procurement professional. And we know that sugar comes from various sources. You know, it could come from bees, it can come from fruit, but predominantly it comes from sugar cane and sugar beet. And the reason I use this as an example, because certain things are happening in those supply chains. Sugar cane, for instance, the main growers of sugar cane are places like Brazil, Thailand, China, India, and all of those places are not without their own challenges, human rights issues, worker safety, and particularly around things like climate change. A good example really is what's happening in Brazil at the moment, whereas in North Brazil, they begin to get real yield losses of sugar cane because of climate change. Now, what that's meaning is that actually they begin to migrate, the farmers are migrating to southern Brazil, where the air temperatures and the CO2 conditions are much better for growing sugar cane. Now, why are we talking about that? Well, because you've got whole swathes of people migrating from one area to another. We have to think about worker conditions. We have to think about pay. We have to think about the impact on the environment. That already cleared large areas of trees in the north to grow agriculture. Are they having to do the same in the south? So it has a direct impact. So climate change is a big one for us there. And if you're buying products that have sugar in, surely you need to know about that, the impact of the decisions you are making. Sugar, as we know, is in food products, but it's also in pharmaceuticals. It's also in Biofuels, we're using sugar in biofuels. It's also used in agricultural products for food stock for animals, etc., etc. So we do need to know about the supply chain we're growing in. And the other one is sugar beet. So sugar beet, not so much production. Sugar cane, something like 2 billion tonnes of sugar a year we use. Whereas sugar beet is more like 250 million tonnes, so not so much. But who are the main producers of sugar beet? Question for you. So Germany, France, and obviously we had Brexit, and Brexit caused issues around tariffs and supply chain issues, etc., etc. We have the US, and then we have Russia and Ukraine. Russia and Ukraine are the biggest producers. Ukraine's about sixth. Russia's the biggest producer of sugar beet. And because of export bans and tariff issues, Ukraine's already hit their quota for the year, so of actually exporting sugar beet. So all of these sorts of things have an impact. And again, we should understand when we're buying our donuts, what's happening in the supply chain for sugar. And climate change is going to be a massive impact on that, because as we get climate change, we're already hearing about, again, about migration, but also as climate changes as expected, we might see decreases in, so France, for instance, might see a decrease in the yield for sugar, and we'll start to see it shift into Northern Europe. So we'll have different countries coming on board growing sugar. And we need to make sure that we continue to get the right working conditions, that we're looking from a social impact point of view, but also from an environmental impact, what might happen if we start to move our crops around the world. And I think it's really useful to use that as an example, because a lot of procurement people that we speak to, procurement supply chain people, are perhaps not aware beyond the contract they're making with their tier one suppliers exactly what's happening in their supply chains. And we're trying to get them to be much more curious about what is happening. And that's a great example. I could have talked about any other commodity. We could talk about tantalum, we could talk about gold, these things found in mobile phones. We could talk about any sort of commodity and it'd have a similar story to it. So it's really, really important that we understand the products and their makeup and what's happening in their world. So we do a lot of talking about that. And the reason being is that organisations are beginning to think about the environment. They're beginning to think about social issues. We're starting to see companies building in the word sustainability or ethical practice into their vision, mission and goals. But what does that really actually mean? It means that all of their policies, their processes, their procedures should reflect the objectives that they're trying to make as an organisation. And again, having real alignment across their policies so it links back and that they all work together rather than against each other is really critical. And we know as procurement people, and any of you that have been involved in procurement supply chain, you often have different conflicting objectives. I've got to save money, but I've got to have high quality, but I also need to have it delivered on time. But I've also got to be sustainable while I'm thinking about it, and I've got to work with my suppliers in an ethical way. All of those things can be quite conflicting in nature, particularly this cost one. We've got to get it cheaper, but we've got to be sustainable. Now, it's not to say that we can't do those things, and we absolutely can, but we have to work together and across our supply chain to make that happen. How do we do that? Well, we need to make sure that the people that are doing the procurement and supply and making those decisions have the right knowledge, they have the right skills. So the knowledge is being curious and understanding what they're buying. The skills, how do they work together? So things like collaboration and things like proper project planning and things around good negotiation and good things around effective communication, all these skills that you need to work across the supply chain. And then we've got to have the right behaviours. It's no point us building a vision and mission that says that we are going to be sustainable, and to be sustainable we're going to be collaborative, and then our behaviours are anti-collaboration, so that we build in things into our contracts, and I'll talk about it later on, that we start to behave in a way that is very, I suppose, not collaborative. And I see this quite a lot. We're saying we're going to be collaborative, but then our behaviours don't reflect that. Our contracts should reflect the relationships that we want to have with our suppliers. And if we can get those things right, then we can reach the outputs and the outcomes that we genuinely want. And that is to be commercial, because it's important. Organisations need to be commercial, otherwise we don't survive. But we also need to be ethical, and we also need to have a look at sustainability as well. So hopefully that makes sense. So as a buyer, as a procurement and supply chain professional, what do we want from our procurement teams? So some of you might be involved in buying already, but some of you might not be, and you might be looking to see, okay, what can I get from my procurement team? And there's so much more when buying a product or service than what's on the front of it. I'm just using a Christmas cracker joke here: when there's a door, not a jar, or when it's a jar. There's so much more to it. It's not just a door. What's the door for? Where has the door come from? What is the door being made of? How is it being shipped? As a discerning consumer, we're very interested in things like where is it made and where is it being shipped from, if we're a discerning consumer. So we might be interested in buying fair trade products, because we know that if we're buying fair trade, then the likelihood is there's been fair pay, there's good working conditions. Hopefully we're not seeing any signs of modern slavery, and perhaps the organisation is looking very closely at its carbon footprint and its carbon emissions. And as a consumer, we'd be interested in that. So why not as a procurement and supply chain manager of an organisation? We're also very interested as a consumer in what the materials are made of. So as a consumer, we might be looking for biodegradable or products that are going to last a long time, so durable materials. Again, as a procurement professional, we want to make sure that we've got one eye on that. So what is happening? Where is that product? Another question is, where is that product going at the end of its life cycle? So when we don't need it anymore. As a consumer, we're quite keen on that now. We're really looking at recycling, making sure that the recycling is actually going to a recycling plant and is not finding its way into landfill. So we would have the same as a procurement supply chain professional in an organisation. I don't know about you, but I quite often look for natural products because I know it's likely to degrade, whereas we know that synthetic products are not likely to degrade. So the same as a buyer, a procurement and supply chain professional, they should be looking for these things as well. And off the back of that, am I buying something that could be repaired? Am I buying something that could be recycled? Am I buying something that can be upcycled at a later date? I love programs like the Repair Shop, where we're recycling and upcycling. Why don't we apply those thoughts in our business? Packaging is an interesting one because we often look at packaging. Now we know that there's a bit of a plastic crisis, and environmentally we're concerned about that. But we also know that plastics protect. So if you take something like fruit and veg, we know we're in that dichotomy of, do we put plastic on our fruit and veg so that there's less waste because it protects it for a longer period, or do we know that there is going to be waste if we don't put plastic packaging on? So we're always in that dichotomy. And that is a decision that the procurement supply chain professional needs to be looking at in their own job. What is the packaging? How is it being packaged? Are we actually giving too much packaging? It's actually a big question. that should be on the minds of most procurement and supply chain professionals. And then you've got brand reputation. You know, are you supporting a supplier across the supply chain that is perhaps, you know, got a good brand from a environmental and social reputation point of view, or is somebody in that supply chain that's not got a good brand? You know, are they supporting a good cause? Is their brand very transparent? Do we know where they stand from a sustainability point of view? And a lot of these questions we need to be asking up front. So it's not just about the product itself, I think, and this is a question I often pose to procurement professionals. You know, it's not just about buying the product or service itself, it's actually having a real think about the impact of the decision that you're going to make when you buy that product. And I'm sure you'll be pleased to know that one of the questions we often ask is, do you really need it? Do you need to buy it at all, or can you do something different? So what I want to do is I just want to very quickly run through, and then we'll get to some questions. But the main thing I want to do is run through our sustainable procurement cycle, because there's different things that we can be doing at different stages. Now, I know you can't see this too clearly at the moment. You might be able to go out so you can see it a bit clearly. But essentially, our procurement cycle is got 3 stages. There's what you do before you start to do the sourcing, so the thinking time that you need to give yourselves. Then you're going to go into finding the right supplier who's going to give you everything that you need. And then you're going to place your contract. And then what are you going to do once that contract has been placed? And the way that we look at that is, first of all, that pre-procurement stage, you've got to ask yourself some questions. So going back to my diagram about your vision and your mission and your goals, what are your sustainability goals? What do you really want to achieve? And we are big on the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and we believe that organisations should look at those 17 goals and decide on the ones that you think you can make the most out of or have the most impact on. It's also important to, and because we can't do everything, I think this is the important bit, we can't do everything. So picking something that you can do most with. You need to understand the regulatory context, and I believe some of you, you're probably from all over the world, so you're going to have different regulations, things like you know, your environmental standards. You can have different environmental standards. So a procurement and supply chain professional should really understand what those standards are and have a good understanding that when they're making the decisions, are they meeting the regulatory compliance? Thinking about the whole life cycle, we've been talking about this for years, but what's the whole life cycle of sustainability? How long is it going to take to buy? How long is the contract going to run for? How long will it end? And what happens at the end? What happens to those products and services? And really having a good understanding of what the market dynamics are, being curious. You know, if you're working in construction versus working in garments, working in textiles, working in pharmaceuticals, there's going to be different market dynamics going on. So have a real understanding of the market that you're playing in. And then understanding the benefits of you making the right decisions as a procurement and supply chain professional. That's what you want from your procurement and supply chain professionals. You want them to really understand that if they meet those sustainability goals, what are they going to get out of it for your organisation? And it could be really good commercial decisions, it could be innovation, it could be collaboration, it could be security of supply for your products, it could be all those types of things. What are the benefits of good sustainable decisions? And then really understanding the risks of what could go wrong if you make the wrong decision. I don't know if any of you have been around for a little while, like I have, but the government, when the government went over to having recycled paper, for instance, and the impact it had on all of the printers, because the recycled paper caused the printers to break down, is a great example of a consequence of making a decision. So think about very clearly the decision that you're going to make and what could be the possible consequence of that. And then lastly, there's loads of things, but also deciding on the routes to market. and the process you're going to be using. If we're going to be talking sustainability, what we don't want to have is a process that's really unsustainable, uses a lot of paper, uses a lot of time and things like that. Really think about the process that we make, and start to live and breathe that sort of culture of sustainability. And then in the sourcing stage, making sure that the suppliers understand what it is you're trying to achieve. And I think this is something that we see missing a lot. And I think where you can help, if, as I said, if you've got procurement supply chain professionals in your organisation, or if you are them, you can really help to lay out what sustainability criteria you need from a supplier selection point of view, making sure that you've got good due diligence, making sure that whatever decision you're making is proportional as well, and carried out, for the right commodities, I suppose, and selected and suppliers. I think it's really important that you run the process smoothly, and keeping sustainability front and centre. It's one of the things that I often see is that, like I said at the beginning, you've got this quality, time, sustainability and cost dilemmas. Sometimes they're competing, but sustainability shouldn't get lost in the conversation, and that can often happen in that ethical practice. It can often happen when we're pushed towards a particular direction. It's sustainability should be embedded into the decision making that's being made, and it's so that we get that right balance. And then finally, making sure that the evaluation that you make, and when you're deciding what supplier, it should be very much evidence-based. So again, something that we see quite often is that a criteria would be put in, the supplier would send in, some words, and something I used to say to my children, it's not words, it's about action. You want to see it in action. They can, a supplier can give you all sorts of thoughts and ideas and say, this is what we're doing. Proper case studies, proper scenarios, opportunities to go and see what they're actually doing is really important when committing to a supplier. You want to see the action taking place, and you want to make sure that the commitments are in place for you as well. So I think that's really an important aspect. And then lastly, when we get to the contract stage, the implementation could look very different from what you originally thought it was going to happen. You've gone through all this lovely stuff, you've done the analysis, you've placed something with the supplier, and then the whole plan, what we were going to measure and how we were going to deal with it, drifts away. The contract, and I've seen this with organisations, the contract is then forgotten about, and then we're just into the business as usual. The contract should be a live document. It should be something that is meaningful. So if there are service level agreements, or if there are obligations that we've committed to around things like carbon reduction, or perhaps we were saying, well, we want to see in it reduction in perhaps waste or energy consumption or anything like that, that's in your contract. Then the contract manager, whoever's going to be managing it, should be very much involved in that handover, so that it's very clear and we understand exactly what both parties have agreed to. And often that's the bit that's missed, is that contracting bit. And again, if you are if you're involved in the decision-making process, or if you're involved in the procurement supply sourcing, or if you're involved in the contract management stage, we can really help each other by getting together and talking to one another to make sure that we all understand what the commitment was. And watch out for things like, if the supplier's actually been, I know it's a term used a lot, but greenwashing, where they've actually said that they're doing certain things, but then when you get into it, you realise that through the warehousing and transportation schemes, perhaps it's not as environmentally friendly as you would have hoped it to be. So, holding suppliers to account on the standards that you place is really, really important. And sometimes the only way to do that is to get out of your building and actually go out and do a review, or get somebody to go and do a review for you. So any sustainability practice, it has to be enduring. It's in the name, I think, and we need to run it through the life of the contract. So we need to think about making sure that we meet all the other requirements, but also that there's, that we keep administrative burdens too low. We need to have proper measurement regimes. We have to have proper means to communicate to one another. We have to have that continuous dialogue. So again, often what we see is that contracts are let for a long period of time, and the original people that set up that contract are no longer working for the organisations, and those new people that don't really understand what the commitments were. So ensure that that continuity is there, that the contract is as sustainable as what we're looking for. And so, it brings me round to the end, the reason why we have it as a cycle is because at the end we need to be sitting down with the suppliers and looking at continuous improvement, looking at the learning that we've had, and thinking about, okay, so once we start all this again, how are we going to do it different? So for the next generation of suppliers, we can pass on our learning and make improvements. And that is improvements for the end user, for the procurement team, and for the suppliers. And we can begin to pave the way for even greater sustainability. So how do we help our suppliers really live a sustainability business? And that is by working alongside our suppliers and treating our suppliers more as a critical friend rather than an arch enemy, which sometimes we see. So working closely with them, being much more collaborative. So just my last slide, and then we'll go to questions. What is the priorities? What priorities do we set as procurement supply professionals? So we need to deliver value and thinking about cost, quality, time, and sustainability, and being ethical. Not only just about cost, I think that's really important, but we do need to be commercial, because if, as procurement supply professionals, if your procurement supply professionals are not commercial, then they're going to have to answer to their CEOs and CPOs and their top management. So commerciality is important, but these other aspects need to be part of it. We need to make sure that we understand our supply chains and that we make a way of them being resilient and robust. And the way to do that is through collaboration and making sure that we've got the right suppliers. Absolute commitment to ethical practice and having high integrity, really important. Not just from a brand point of view, this is a very practical thing, because if the suppliers trust you and they see you as ethical, and we trust our suppliers, then we work better together. Yeah, and we don't clash, and that really helps with things like negotiation, things like that. Obviously, delivering a commitment to sustainability, and going back to something I said, you have to pick the elements of sustainability, and I think the UN Sustainable Development Goals is a good place to start. Thinking about how do we then use our sourcing process to get real innovation across our supply base, and when I talk about innovation, I often talk about sustainability and innovation together, and creativity, because I think it's all part of that. And I'm a big believer in looking at our wider supply base, so working with small and medium-sized enterprises who often have much more agility to work with us than the larger organisations. So working with the SMEs, I think is a really important aspect as well. And I try to encourage procurement supply chain professionals to look beyond the large organisations and look at ways that we can get small and medium-sized enterprise involved in as well within our supply chain. So that's probably a whistle-stop tour of some of the things I've been talking to procurement supply chain professionals for over the last year. I just, if you've got any questions.
Sorry, just unmuting myself. Thank you so much, Ian. That was fantastic, and it's so true that how the supplier relationship has got even more important now with increasing requirements for carbon reporting, because of course you have to, if they're in your scope 3 emissions, so you have to ask them for their reliable carbon data as well. So it is a really good point that you need to develop your relationship and it not just be a one-way thing. So that is so true. Now, so quite a lot of our members are quite small. We've got a lot of people on the call today, and they will not be procurement experts. So in terms of the sort of next steps for them, I've shared the IIE policy with you,
Yes.
and you were kind enough to say that it was very acceptable, which is good. What are the what would be the next sort of good steps for people to then take? Because obviously large sort of trying to tackle everything at once is difficult. So how do you suggest that they kind of break it down? I know you've just sort of talked a bit here, but in the kind of next step, action steps sort of thing.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. And I think the first thing is sit down with yourselves and have a think about what is your purpose in this. You know, what is your purpose? And try to think about where you can make the biggest impact. You know, where is your commitment? And this could be in a number of different areas. And you're right. I think an interesting one around reduction in carbon emissions. We know that most of our carbon emissions are not our own, it's in our supply chain. And your supply chains might be very short. You know, you may only have, you might be working directly with a number of other SMEs, you know, who are working directly with you. But the chances are they will have people in their supply chain as well. So getting common purpose across the supply chain is really important. And I think if you're interested in trying to reduce your carbon emissions, for instance, let's take that as an example. It could be water reduction, it could be energy, it could be fuel reduction. You know, it's all part of the impact on commitment. Is actually speaking to those others that you work directly with, and asking them to take the same commitment. And perhaps, you know, as a good first step, is just saying, like, this is something that we want to do, and we'd like to take you on that journey with us. And that's where a lot of large organisations, so if you take some of the larger organisations that we work with, for instance, one of the largest organisations we work with is UK Gov, and they would do the same. They would say, look, we have a commitment to getting to net zero by wherever it is now, 2035. We would like to take you on that journey with us. And I think even if you're a small organisation, I think you can do that, you know, and set that commitment. And, you know, it's very easy then to work with your supply chain and pull together a bit of a scope. You know, where are we going to focus most on? And this could be transport, it could be warehouse costs, it could be how we're going to work. If you were picking something like fair pay, you know, for instance, which is a good one, you know, making sure that everybody in our supply chain is getting paid fairly on time, we've got good working conditions. If you set that as a commitment, you can work together and look at scope, and that could be, you know, coverage, which particular contracts we're going to focus on, which geographical region we're going to focus on, and sort of lay down some thoughts. And I would say that's a good first step. Think about your purpose, get some scope in there, and share your thoughts with your key suppliers.
Yeah, I remember at London Remade, we always used to advise that people would prioritize either sort of using spend, or in their case, in that particular case, which was about buying recycled content, it was about what's your volume. So what's your sort of largest largest product that you're buying in, because they were very much on physical products rather than services. But
yes,
it was a good way to just make it a bit more bite-sized, because it can feel like a massive task, can't it, to try and that's the same with, again, this carbon reporting challenge, is where do you start? Because lots of, even the smallest organizations will have masses of suppliers, so how do you prioritize who, where you go first?
it can be very overwhelming, I think that. And I mean, just generally, when we're talking to procurement supply organisations, we always start off at, like you said there, is where's your spend, where's your big spend areas, where are your bottleneck places, where are the one, which are the organisations or products you can't live without, and they're the ones that you tackle first, and then you can worry about the other things a bit later on. But yeah, I agree.
Yeah. Just a reminder to everyone, please put your questions in the Q&A box if you have them. Just as another question, Ian, how do you then look at sort of success and how things are, whether you've done a good job or not? Does that make sense? And how do you evaluate performance?
Yes, no, I think that's a really good point. Again, it goes back to thinking about where your priorities are, and making sure that I know it's an old adage really, but making sure that you do start to measure it. Baselining. So if you, for instance, are looking at footprint, your carbon footprint, and looking at things like carbon emissions or your CO2 emissions, if you talk to organisations about that, some organisations don't know where to start with that. And where do I start? Do I start with measuring, I don't know, transport mileage, things like that? I always recommend people seek an expert, because there are a lot of organisations out there that can help you with that sort of thing, not least your own organisation, but there are organisations that will help you to identify that. So I think that's really important. And you've got to baseline it, so work out what you are doing typically now and start to do a little bit of trend analysis. It doesn't need to be complicated. So for instance, if you're looking at energy usage, how much energy are you using, electricity and gas? It doesn't need to be complicated. You set a baseline score, this is how much I'm using now, and then you measure that for a period of time, and you can see from a trend point of view when your energy levels go up and when your energy levels go down, and that's really important. Things like I mentioned during the presentation about recycled materials, doing a bit of quick analysis about what's the percentage of recycled materials am I using, and that could be zero at the moment. So baseline yourself, have a look at how much you're using currently, and then as you start to put things into place to focus and start looking at, because the key to this is starting to focus, it's starting to look at it and not ignore it. So when you start putting a focus on things like the use of recycled materials, you can start to measure it, and you baseline, and it could be zero, and then gradually you will see that increase. So I think that's a really important thing. Other simple things like, how much of your products have already been assessed, how many have already got eco labels attached to them, where you're buying your paper from, are you getting paper that's has already been marked as being from sustainable sources, and again, measuring that from a percentage point of view is actually, it's quite a quick task to do. You can have a quick look at it, have a benchmark, and then grow from there, because as soon as you start to focus on it, something happens. And I'll give you a good example of that is women in procurement. Okay, so women in procurement, something that we hadn't potentially looked at for a while, or had looked at all. And then as part of our salary survey, which is really useful, it's open to everybody. It's called the Hays Salary Survey, which we do with Hays, the recruitment organisation. We do it every year. As part of that, we look at equality, diversity and inclusion, And as part of that, we started to focus on looking at how many women are actually working in procurement. And when we first started, it was a very small number. So we raised that as an issue. We went, oh, hold on, you know, look, in this salary, we've just done a percentage. There's only a few percent. There's only sort of 20 something odd percent of women actually working in procurement supply chain roles. Now, there's more women working in supply chain roles than there are men. And the reason is because we put a focus on it. We then talked about it. We put it out there and said, it's something we need to do about this. And we made a difference. And I think it's about focus. When you start to focus on something and put some effort into it, we can start to make a real difference. And we see that with things like energy usage. You see it with waste reduction. You see it with pollution. As soon as you start to focus and start to measure it, you make a real difference.
Yeah, I think what you're actually sort of elements of what you've just described are very, very similar to they're basically the IIE program, which is that you set your policy, you start with your baseline measurement, you decide which areas you're going to target, and then you measure your success in those areas by trying to get sort of data if you can, but otherwise sort of measurable change. If you know, it might be less sort of specific data related, it might be sort of slightly softer, and then revise it and take the next steps after that, so to continue to develop your action. And you know, we always at IIE we get people to focus on, you know, waste and energy are very much year one or the bronze level sort of areas of focus. Transport comes in the second level, in the silver level, and then procurement and various other areas come in, sort of looking at investments and where finances are held and things, that comes in the sort of green level. So you do get that kind of changing focus, and procurement is woven in within all those areas, isn't it? But you might only think about what is termed as, you know, typical procurement, the sort of buying of product when you're in the area, sort of when you're thinking about green procurement itself. Something else that actually popped up about, obviously a lot of organizations have signed up to IIE because the accreditation gives that third-party evaluation of their performance, and we have a part of our website which we really encourage our members to use, which is called the Green Directory, because that talks about how long they've been an IIE member, which accreditation they've achieved, gives a brief description, you know, any specific awards that they've won. So and it works as a really good way for, I'm sure other accreditation programs have something similar, and it works as a really good way to just do a bit of an extra check on whether suppliers, say, who are tendering for your business are doing what they say they're doing. So it's a good thing.
I think it's really important that because I think it's very easy to write in bidding documents that you've got particular standards that you meet, and this is an interesting word from a words point of view. I've seen it before. We meet the standards. They haven't got the standard. They meet the standards, but they haven't actually got the standard. And it's something that we talk to procurement people about, because you need to have evidence that is actually happening. And it's okay to not have those things, but I think as an organisation, I think having that commitment and that focus, and then having some sort of third-party recognition is so important, because then you have the evidence, and it's good for yourself as well, because then you've got somebody else looking at it and going, well, actually, yes, but have you thought about this, this, and this? And so it's a great learning opportunity when you go through somebody that has an accreditation program like yours. It's a good learning program, and you don't know what you don't know. And I think working with somebody that does know is really, really important.
So I've got sort of one last question, then we'll wrap up. Have you got actually, well, I've got sort of two, but one is, how do you prevent sort of leakage? So, or kind of, you've set all your brilliant policies up and things like that, and then how do you make sure that you don't get people
doing the
just
thing.
popping off, yeah, exactly, doing the internet shopping because they need something quickly?
Yeah. It's so hard. It's so hard. It's for me, it's about culture change, and about re-emphasizing policies and processes systems. It's really important that whoever's responsible for this, and as I said, it doesn't necessarily have to be a procurement professional. You might be just one or two or three people in your organisation. But it's really important that whoever's responsible for making these decisions is visible in the organisation and talks about the benefits of doing it properly. And sometimes it might be a little bit slower. I'm really sorry, because people do rush out because they need it now. So sometimes it might be a little bit slower, but the benefit, the long-term benefit, is going to be greater for the organisation by going through the processes properly. So it's culture change is my biggest thing. Does it prevent everybody doing it? No, of course it doesn't. I remember a CEO of mine going out and buying himself a desk, when I had a contract which we'd set up with this very reputable furniture organisation, but the CEO wanted a particular desk. So did I have a conversation with them? Of course I did. It's really important that that the CEO is setting an example. So did I speak to him? Yes, I did. Did I stop him from doing it? No, he still bought that desk. But I think it's important to. I think for us, because we're obviously, if we're all here, we're really interested in what's happening in the world. I think it's important for us to be advocates for it and to make sure that we're visible to talk about what is good. So yeah.
And I've got one last quick question. Have you got any sort of very good sort of examples of where innovation has led to greener procurement? And sort of one example which I'll give, which while you maybe think, is when I was working with Sainsbury's, and they had, it was, this is 20 years ago, so it was in the early days of where you could they just got some printers where you could set it to default double-sided printing, which and by doing that and being a bit dictatorial about it, and in those days, thinking was a bit different, and everybody thought, there were lots of people who said they still wanted to print it only on single-sided, but by setting it to default double-sided, they actually saved a lot on their paper purchasing, and rather just taking all of the savings and putting it into another, just putting it into another budget or something, they said, well, we'll take some of the savings from not buying so much paper, and we'll put it into buying a more environmental paper, which at that time was more expensive. So they upped the price, the acceptable price per ream, or they went for a slightly more environmental paper in their procurement. So there was sort of double win in that they had reduced their use of paper overall, but in their purchasing, that they switched the product they were purchasing to be a more environmental alternative.
Yeah, no, that's really good actually. Yeah. I like that because it's simple and it's good. It's easy to do. And I think other organisations benefit from that learning, I think, as well. One I was going to think about is centre parks, actually. So a relative of mine actually is their head of transport at Centre Parks, and so what they have done is that they've moved. So they have a lot of vehicles. If you've ever been to Centre Parks, it's a big holiday complex, or a number of holiday complexes in different parts of Europe, and we've got a number of them in the UK. And as soon as you drive up to the gate, you have to get out your car and you leave your car in the car park. And when you go into Centre Parks, you then have a bike. So you can get yourself a bicycle and you can cycle around as merrily as you like for a week. And there's hardly any transport. The only transport that's in there is the transport that's for people like the cleaners, the engineers, anybody that's, sort of needs to move around quite quickly. And they have like little vehicles. And They used to have like little diesel vehicles. They've all moved, so it's completely moved them across to electric vehicles now. But the important bit, what I thought was really interesting as part of the project, was, again, why I think focus is so important. They spent time really looking at movements, so scheduling, how people are actually moving around, how often they're moving around, the distance they're travelling in the centre parks itself, and it looked at all of the different parks as well to see if anything was different. And they started to look at rescheduling so that they could start to reduce the amount of travelling time they were doing, because they were travelling out, travelling back, travelling out, travelling back. Do they need to do that? And so they've changed that whole scheduling process to start to reduce the cost, the transport. So they've done it anyway by using electric vehicles, but they've also started to reduce the movement and the kilometres of movement, etc., etc. And I think that's really interesting. And I think organisations who have transport, any form of transport in your supply chain, one of the good things to do is to start looking at scheduling, start looking at your transport, how far your transport's moving, the different drop-off points, the different stopping points, etc., etc. It's always a good place to do, not just from a cost point of view, but from a transport calculation point of view. You know, is there some better way of working? Can you work in, for instance, with hubs, with smaller vehicles, etc., etc. So, you know, I thought that was a good example.
So with that, I would like to say a big thank you to Ian. That was brilliant, really interesting, and so useful. Thank you very much.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.